Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to our next session. This one is going to be very interesting. Not that the others have not been, but I'm really looking forward to this session. We have two presenters who will be talking about using primary documents in the classroom. And we all know that it's important to do that. We know it's important to get firsthand testimony from people who have been affected by genocide. But we're going to get two very specific examples here today of primary documents that have been useful to our teachers, our two presenters. So let me introduce them. The first presenter is Jessica Antoline, who teaches modern world history and genocide studies in Lexington, Massachusetts. Jessica has served as curator of Jewish history and public programs at the Yiddish Book Center and has been an intern at the Auschwitz Jewish Center. She was raised nearby Greensburg, where we are right now at Seton Hill University. She was raised in New Alexandria, PA. And Jessica is also an adjunct faculty member here at Seton Hill. And some of those of you in the audience have had her for class. And our next presenter then will be Heidi Neubauer, who lives in Mankato, Minnesota, and teaches English at South Central College and also Minnesota State University. Heidi adopts an interdisciplinary perspective in her teaching that incorporates history, religion, myth, and literature. She's a graduate of our certificate in Genocide and Holocaust Studies, a program that some of you here are enrolled in currently. And she also was the winner of our LaFrac Outstanding Student of the Holocaust Award. So we're happy to have Heidi back here with us. So with that, let's welcome Jessica.
Hello. We're a much smaller audience right now, which actually might be kind of great because I hope you can hear me okay. I have a big ask of you for this talk and this presentation, which is we're going to be looking at the letter that hopefully you have at your tables. And my big ask at the end of all of this is that you take this and use it however you can, because it's so special. And so I'm going to tell you a story today about how this letter came into my possession. And so I just wanted to say good afternoon and thank you, right, to Seton Hill and to Jim and to all the staff here for having this conference, because it is so important and it's so nice to be with other educators. And this is also a really selfish presentation because I have that ask of you. When someone recently asked me what I love to do, I said two things. I said teaching genocide studies, and I said supporting refugees. And I didn't realize at the time just how much both of those meant to me. In fact, Harun, I have to apologize to walking out during your talk because I was receiving messages from an Afghan refugee in Lexington who is seriously considering going home to Afghanistan because her mother is sick. She is really experiencing what so many refugees experience, which is this intense pull to be back, right, in your home. And we've been texting back and forth. So my apologies, but it's a really stunning example of what we're talking about today, and the refugee experience and experience of asylum seekers. This is sort of the work that I pretty much spend all of my time doing. And when I think about it all, I can trace both of these loves to my mother. Her name is Edith. She came here to Greensburg. She lived in a very small apartment near the library, and she came here from Panama. She is a stunningly good researcher. She is a professional level genealogist and took up lockpicking in her 70s. So she's pretty fantastic. And I think she has always been interested in the truth, historical truth, no matter what it is, no matter how hard it is. And she is actually the source of the story I have to tell you today. So it's her. And when I first imagined how I could contribute to this conference, because I actually haven't been an educator very long, my background is entirely in Jewish history and archaeology. When I thought about it, J.D. Vance had yet to accuse Haitians who are living in Springfield, Ohio, of eating their neighbors' cats and dogs. We all know, right, about this story. He is now our vice president, and that really is a reminder to the world, right, that targeting the most valuable members and vulnerable members of our communities remains a powerful political tool in the 21st century. And I just wanted to, right, just have this on the board for just a little bit, right? I'm sure you're familiar with this article. This was one of the most famous ones from the event. And this is a quote from this article about Haitians being accused of doing this and the effects of it, right, on the community. So it was really interesting. Vance's absurd claim was widely denounced, and it was easily traced back to its attention-grabbing origins. And it meant that the residents of Springfield suddenly needed to shield themselves from their fellow Americans, right, for their own safety. And that is exactly what they did. Springfield's officials rallied around their Haitian residents, protecting them as much as they could from hate groups, social media influencers, anonymous bomb threats, and even the presence of former and soon-to-be president, again, Donald Trump himself. Even the parents of Aiden Clark had to shield their own grieving family by repeatedly denunciating the use of their child's death to promote rumors about Haitians on social media. This is a great example of that. Vance knew the power of his racist rumors. Yet when questioned about his claims concerning Haitian residents in Springfield during the only vice presidential debate, Vance demanded journalists not fact-check him. Rumors and articles ran rampant across the internet, just like this opinion column at Fox News. And this is a quote from the opinion maker about what he discovered about this incident. But like Trump before him, right, Vance looked Americans in the eye and he never retracted his words, right? And so, instead of receiving the support they originally sought from their state officials, including Vance, Springfield residents had to work even harder to help Haitians access their city's housing, language, schooling, and counseling resources. And this added a new layer of fear and exhaustion on top of the work that already tested the limits of any individual's benevolence and empathy. All of these events occurred as I asked my world history and genocide studies students to watch the presidential debates and consider each candidate's positions. I asked them to decide who won each major talking point, such as immigration or women's maternal health, and justify their answers. This is what we do, right, in social studies class. And my students in Lexington come from all over the world and speak over a dozen languages. And when I reviewed their work, it was clear that the majority of them understood when the candidates did not answer most questions directly, right? It disturbed them or it annoyed them, and they commented on it quite a lot. However, it wasn't clear that the majority of my students had a sense of Vance's ability to lie. And it was quite clear how much he was manipulating the public to perhaps adults, but not to students. But he was. And that public included my students. Vance was using Haitians as stepping stones in his political career, and so I paused my curriculum and I turned toward Springfield. All of the presentations so far have addressed the reality of Springfield in their own ways. of hate in America, contributing to the inability of our government to increase or significantly reform immigration to support those fleeing devastation and oppression, or of being othered in a community through false rumors, scapegoating, and outright hatred. Rumors like these, including those spread by Vance and Trump, take advantage of our youth, denying fact-checking in real time during debates and allowing candidates to avoid answering questions clearly and directly means that students lack the basic building blocks necessary for making informed decisions about leadership. Vance refused to give listeners the accurate information and civil discourse that they deserved, and instead packaged and labeled his talking points as masculine, patriotic, professional, and most critically during the debate, Midwest nice. And I knew that I had to address Vance's rumors in all of my classes, but how could I help students understand that what he was doing was nothing new, right? Politicians do this all the time, no matter what their backgrounds are. This question prompted me to return to the proceedings of the 2023 LaFrac conference and the words of Dr. Carol Rittner, who asked educators to consider the relationship between teaching about the Holocaust and learning from the Holocaust. Examining the complications of immigration and the limits of benevolence remain essential to teaching about the Holocaust. And so I decided to begin there, turning to a document that guided my own journey towards teaching Holocaust history, the last known words of a young Jewish man named Max Gans, whose desperate attempt to escape Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia failed. I hope that having Max's story sit together with the stories in Springfield could get my students to learn from the Holocaust. So I want to offer each of you opportunities to honor Max's life in your classrooms, whether you teach about the Holocaust or genocide studies, American history, for a week, right, a month, a semester, or an entire academic year if you are so lucky to do so. So first I'm just going to share some basic information about Max and events in Czechoslovakia that can set the stage for your own unique lessons. And then I'll present just a few ways that you can honor Max's life by connecting it to events and concepts relevant to a wide range of curriculum, including current events in Springfield. And all of these resources are going to be available in a digital folder that I will share with you. And may Max's memory be for a blessing. So Max, who we have no photographs of, was born on March 11th in 1914, as you can see in your letter, when it was then Austro-Hungary. 12 days prior to the occupation of his country on March 15th, 1939, Max sent a letter to one Dolores Gans in Baltimore, Maryland. Like thousands of other Jews facing the reality of Nazi occupation, expansion, and persecution, Max's letter was a request for an affidavit of support from a total stranger that shared his surname. According to his letter, Max had a cousin in Baltimore who could not offer financial support, and therefore Max appealed to Dolores to aid in his securing of a visa to the United States. My mother, Edith, acquired a copy of Max's letter by accident. She acquired it in 1998 when she was searching for information on our Gans family line in southern Pennsylvania and Maryland. Writing to Baltimore residents, this was before Ancestry.com, writing to Baltimore residents with the same last name, she connected with a man named Edgar, who sent her a package of information on potential Gans family connections. It was just a stack of random information. Dolores Gans was Edgar's sister, and Max's letter to her was included in this package. Neither Dolores nor Edgar were Jewish, but Gans was a common Czech and German surname of both Jews and Christians. It means goose in Yiddish. And so it was really understandable that Max wrote to Dolores. Often Jews and other people seeking to come to the United States would acquire American phone books and look for the last names that were the same as theirs and write completely random letters to strangers hoping they would assist them. So Max lived in this incredibly picturesque town of what's called České Budějovice, and it's about 90 miles south of the Czech capital of Prague. And as you can see, the letters at your tables, right, Max did not list the names of his family members or other details of his personal life in the letter. Like other Jews seeking affidavits, Max focused his words on detailing his professional and language skills instead. So almost no records exist of Max's experiences during the Holocaust, and these are the only words that we know that exist from him. But he likely faced the same terror as other Jews in the city before his deportation to Theresienstadt, which is Terezín in the Czech language, which was the only German ghetto and concentration camp in occupied Czechoslovakia. So Max's story is common, and I think that that's important to say. He was not exceptional in his journey. Most Czech Jews were taken to Theresienstadt, but some ended up as far away as Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, especially women doing forced labor. So his is not exceptional. This just shows you a little bit of how this worked. Czechoslovakia was an independent democratic nation after World War I, as I'm sure you know, and with Nazi occupation, it was split into two, with the Czech dominant-speaking peoples in the west and independent Slovakia in the east. So persecution of Czechoslovak Jews in this area actually began before Max wrote his letter in 1939. It grew from both external, obviously right, German forces and German occupiers, and internal fascist groups and individuals that collaborated with the Nazis, including Czech groups like Vlajka. They were a nationalist group of Czechs. And thus the annexation right, of the Sudetenland in 1938, after the Munich Agreement, this opened the gates for increasingly brutal anti-Semitic acts from Germans and ethnic Czechs. So Jews were about 80,000 to 90,000 people in the area where Max lived in Western Czechoslovakia, and they, of course, immediately became targets. So these actions only increased as Hitler violated the Munich Agreement and occupied the remainder of the Czech lands on March 15th, 1939, declaring it the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and splintering it from Slovakia. So Max is stuck in the West. Jewish persecution began almost immediately in the Protectorate, including in Max's city of České Budějovice. And this is really well documented for those of you who are really interested in sort of Eastern European experiences during the Holocaust and immigration. Katarzyna Czapkova and Hilo Kival have a work called Prague and Beyond, the Jews in Bohemian Lands, that documents as much as they can what really happened in the region, which is decidedly different than, for example, Poland. It's a very different case. But over the next year, Jews like Max would have had their property confiscated, their synagogues destroyed, and employment became next to impossible. The Nazis would then restrict Jewish movement within Czech cities and to rural areas for fear that Jews were actually acquiring goods on the black market. So they might go from the city to rural farms and acquire goods. So they restrict all movement, so Jews in the city had to stay there. And finally, Max actually would have lost all chances for immigration when the Nazis banned any Jew who was of working age from leaving the Protectorate in February of 1940, and Max was not even 30. He was not even 30. So what we don't know what Max's life was like day to day. He may have been forced alongside other Jews to do forced labor in his city and elsewhere in the Protectorate. It was quite common, right? We say forced labor, and I think the narrative is often moving towards saying slave labor because that's exactly what it was. What we do know is that in the fall of 1941, Jewish life took a radically different turn. Reich Security Main Office Chief Reinhard Heydrich, who you've probably heard of, certainly one of the most well-known figures of the Holocaust, he ordered the creation of a ghetto-style camp within the northern garrison town of Theresienstadt, Terezín. as part of the final solution to the Jewish question in Eastern Europe. On October 17th, Germans began to deport Jews to the east, and on November 24th, they began the first transports to Theresienstadt itself. These continued until the spring of 1945. And what's interesting is somehow Max avoided the forced deportations in 1941 and 42, and that's probably due to sheer luck and the fact that he was young and, as you can see in his letter that you're reading, was incredibly skilled in machinery. And so that made him very valuable, right, to the Nazi system. But what was clear in the few documents that remain of Max is that he would be in Prague, the Czech capital, the administrative center of Jewish life in the Protectorate, and he was there on July 5th, 1943, when he was finally deported on Transport DE to Theresienstadt with 603 other Jewish prisoners. This is his deportation card that was taken to Prague, but he would have been given this in České Budějovice, so it would have been delivered to his home, wherever he was, and then he would have had to report to Prague. When Max arrived in Prague, he would have had all of his belongings confiscated. He was then given the number of prisoner 55. Then Max would have waited, perhaps, right, days, for the train to depart north to Theresienstadt. Max endured several months in this ghetto camp before he was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau on December 18th. It is presumed that Max was killed in Auschwitz, as this is where his last records exist. So this letter that you have is really the only words, because the other documents that exist of Max are only from the perpetrator. They're only from the perpetrator. Max was one of 263,000 Jews living in the former Czechoslovak Republic who were murdered by the Nazis, including, it turns out, his wife. The SS forced her onto the same transport as Max from Prague to Theresienstadt, so they would have been together then. But then she was transferred to Germany to a camp called Neuengamme in Hamburg, Germany, where she was killed. They would have not known each other's fates, and it turns out his wife, of all names, was Edith. This is Edith's record, as you can see, and I use this in my classrooms alongside the other documents in this slideshow to help students see how we piece narratives together, how we do real history. This document, as you can see, it gives a small bit of information, but what is on sort of halfway through the document is this notification that she was in fact married. Edith was, right, a few days shy of just her 24th birthday. So Edith lost all of her family, and so did Max. So did Max. None of them survived. And Max's name, the way I found him, actually wasn't through these records first. I had the letter, and then I, as an 18-year-old, decided to travel to Prague to find him. And I found him, and he is one of the 80,000 names on the Czech memorial in Prague that is handwritten on the synagogue. It's called the Pinkas Synagogue in the Jewish quarter of Prague. This is one of the earliest memorials to the Holocaust in Europe, handwritten, every single one. And Max was there quietly in a corner, right? And so this is just a little bit of information that you can give your kids, right, about what happened to Max to help place Max's life into context of the Holocaust and occupied Czechoslovakia, and I'll share all those documents with you. But as Nick yesterday reminded us so well, students who make connections to the Holocaust by seeing themselves, their friends, and their neighbors in the story as what it means to have and lose fundamental human rights are more likely to move from learning into action. Nick also reminded us of Article 70 here in Pennsylvania that affects educators here. And I really wanted to ask you to take a look at this, right? Is this not what happened to Haitian peoples in Springfield, right? Were their difficulties not the result of unchecked ignorance and discrimination, all the way to the White House? Because one of the growing challenges that Holocaust teachers face is relevancy in the classroom. Most of my students have no concept of who a Jew is and the diversity within that. They don't know much about the Holocaust. They come from all over the world. And I can't think, though, of a more relevant story for my kids right now than Springfield. As we move further in time, away from the horrors of the Holocaust, and our student populations become more diverse, how do we help them make meaningful connections, right? How do they learn about it and from its victims' experiences? Max's letter offers an excellent chance to connect to a range of topics, especially immigration. It is short, it's translatable, right? It does not actually require too much context to overwhelm a student who's new to the subject. And so it really offers this chance to get a lot of different inroads in with your students. And I believe, right, that Max's letter can offer teachers who work even within the most divisive political climates a chance for students, right, to explore the complexities of the immigration system in America. So just want us to sort of pause for a second and consider who our students are, right? My school has a growing population of Haitian students, as well as refugee students from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine. Those are our largest populations. I teach about the Haitian Revolution every single year in my world history classes, and this makes Vance's false rumors a reality we need to face in my classroom. So what realities do your students need to face, right? To what communities do your students feel like they belong? And what current events could you have your students explore that connect to Max's experiences? Only when students have a sense of how desperate Max's situation was can they transition to understanding the nuances of his letter and connecting his experiences to the stories of today. Consider the time, right, that you might have for a lesson on Max's letter, right, and the goals you might want to achieve with it. This determines whether or not your students will be able to do more exploration on their own of what happened in Czechoslovakia, or you might need to give them some background information. And consider how you might have students even potentially do some independent research to figure out what life was like around Max. Teachers, I'm sure you all know, right, you can also use clips of the recent documentary, the PBS documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, right, to establish that context around the difficulties of immigration and belonging in America. It's a phenomenal piece. How many of you know it? Have you used it in your classrooms? Yeah, so they even offer clips at pbs.org that talk about immigration and the discrimination here during that time, right, that led to Jews not having quotas increased to support their needs, but rather often decreased in the hope of decreasing them by our government. So this documentary is relatively new still, and it offers excellent insights and parallel narratives that explain why Max required the affidavit from someone like Dolores. Why was he doing that? Why was he writing to a random person with his same last name? You could even use, right, the narratives that we received yesterday, right? The graphic stories, right, to make this accessible for your students. So we just, of course, always need to be sure that any contextual information on Max includes maps, right, like the ones here, and modeling the use of reliable academic sources, which we'll see in the next few slides, a couple of examples of that. But this really gets to the heart of what many social studies teachers do, right, which is a lot of media studies, right, and how we acquire reliable information, how we check it. And so I have in the digital folder that you'll receive and in these slides some sample questions to start out conversations, right, depending on your students' background knowledge, how invested they are in Max's story, that can help you sort of start looking at Max in more depth. So these will be available to you. And I also wanted to share with you in the digital folder just some really easy ways that you can have students do the activity of like sourcing things on their own, right? So part of the problem with Springfield is the lack of ability to check our sources, right? And who do we get our information from? And so as social studies teachers, many of you, we know that this is an essential part of what we do. It's even more essential now, right, with social media. And not just as an activity, as a task, as a grade, but rather as protection, right, as civic duty, right, to do things like this. And so what I had my students do was to analyze different articles about what happened in Springfield. I didn't have a lot of time, so I had to choose several for them, but obviously, right, you may be able to have students research on their own, depending on your class time. I chose a range of news sources, right? Local news sources like the Columbus Dispatch, national sources, right? And then ones that are considered incredibly reliable like AP, to have them examine, right, the stories of Springfield. So one of the things that I just want to share with you that always makes me smile is, do you guys use this ever? My students love this because it's called the crap test, which is they find funny, right? But it's really reliable. This hangs in my classroom, and we do this all the time. It's one of the ways to make it more fun, that this is not a tedious task for them, but rather that this has a goal, right? That this is just something that has been established for many years. How do you find reliable sources? And so I have my students practice this as they chose the sources that I gave to them and analyze each source. And the important thing was, right, is that the kids are allowed to come up with their own ideas to make it student-centered, right, this exploration of events like Springfield, to have it be on them. I'm not here to tell them who to vote for. I'm not here to tell them, right, how they feel about immigration, but rather to show them what is happening, right, around them so that they can make informed decisions. One of the other things we can do real quick is just, you could also make Max's profile really visible for your students. I actually, before I approached this, I actually had them create a visual profile of Max on really large poster paper that included images, quotations from the letter, and maps. And students found things, for example, like maps that illustrated where Max was born. They used Stars of David to establish Max's Jewish heritage, which was new for a lot of them, understanding that symbol, and used the word hello in Max's languages to express all of his linguistic skills. Completing an activity like this means that both you and your students have this really concrete reference to point to. As you had so beautifully in your presentation, Harun and Kim, the idea of the visual, allowing students to create, is such an important part of the process, especially processing such a traumatic experience as what Max went through. So when I presented my students with Max's letter this year, they consistently noted that he reduced himself to two things: a skilled worker and a persecuted individual. He gave no significant details about his family, as I said, save for his cousin in the United States, who could not support his affidavit. He made no mention of his spouse, Edith, or of his children. Max's letter will hopefully prompt you to ask, and your students to ask, why was this the case? Why did he leave out that information, right? In the digital folder, you'll also see a markup of Max's letter containing the kind of questions I asked my students to help them begin to understand Max's context, right? This was all done before they analyzed parallel news stories about Springfield. Asking students to examine Max's word choice, tone, and purpose can have students grapple with his deportation. Having them examine dates and locations can put Max's life into a rich historical context. The Jewish history of the Czech lands is remarkable. Right? So after having my students examine Max's letter, I then chose a set of articles, as you saw, about Springfield and had them analyze them for parallel information. What was happening between Haitian residents, right, in Springfield and Max's story, right? My students came up with a remarkable set of parallels. They shared how hatred of Haitians in Springfield seemed to spread like a virus, just like the anti-Semitic beliefs that Jews stabbed Germans in the back. They noticed that Max's letter and articles about Springfield seemed to reduce Jews and Haitians to how useful they were economically, rather than emphasizing their human right to live in peace and dignity. They prompted an invaluable discussion on the limits of benevolence. For your more eager students and those who wish to practice advanced academic conversations, Max's letter provides a valuable framework for discussing to what extent governments and communities are responsible for helping those who face genocide. And this really can fit in with the earlier presentations today, right? Thinking about policy, right? And examining that as well. This is also a really great way to not do the traditional kinds of summative assessments, right? Have them explore these limits, have them explore policy in relation to Max's story and to the story of Haitians in Springfield. And finally, just to close, my students wondered why no one seemed to help Jews like Max. Why didn't Dolores help him, right? How couldn't he get out? But thousands seemed in their mind to rally across the country in support of Haitians. Obviously, this is a massive generalization, but students were really trying to grapple with what they had just learned in my class about America, immigration, and the Holocaust. They were stunned that so much media supported Haitians, but did not seem to support Jews in the same way during the war. So it was really interesting to hear them say, why? So just in closing, however you might celebrate Max's life and honor him through your teaching, my hope is that you'll find a way to use this letter to highlight your own students' experiences and your own community's needs. Connecting Max's story to current events ensures that his memory lives on in children's hearts and minds all across the country. This is all that's left of Max, right? So let Max remind us that learning from the Holocaust is still possible and indeed necessary in today's America. So thank you for letting me share a little bit about Max's letter, and please, please do pass it on as you can so that he's everywhere. He's everywhere for us, so thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Am I too loud? So while he's going to get a cord, I just want to say thank you, Jim, and everyone for your warm welcome and for being back at Seton Hill. I'm just grateful to be around a bunch of amazing people talking about this amazing work that we do and how important it is. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit from Jessica in talking more about research that I've done in a manuscript that I'm working on in hopes of a longer book. And also in thinking about propaganda and some teaching points and how we can think about teaching propaganda and looking at myth as well. And just thinking about how those things are very different and how they might get manipulated. Technology is not my strength.
Do you have any audio that you need to take
No.
care of?
Mm-mm. Okay. So I call my presentation Propaganda and Early Occult Nazism, Research and Teaching Points. I have this meme on my syllabus for my composition students. I teach in a community that is very diverse, but I also have a lot of PSEO students, so 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. I have students who have just graduated high school that are coming to college in a traditional sense. I have adult learners coming back to college, 20, 25 years out of high school, taking composition class. So I feel that I try to be very practical in my approach because I have such a complex audience in my teaching. So I feel that Teaching about the Holocaust for me has always been about truth, and it's always been about human dignity and integrity and understanding the power of our voices, and that students have very powerful voices to make change and to be just a good human. So when I started to think about propaganda and completing my graduate certificate here, I just realized how important it is to talk about that as well, especially with the rise of social media, how popular it is, how it is just evolved over time. So narratives of propaganda was the way the early occult societies of Nazism tried to create a myth of the Aryan race. So my presentation looks at two central figures in the late 1800s in Germany and Austria that greatly influenced the thinking of the time. So first I will just talk about the research I've done on them, basically giving a summary of my paper that will be in the conference proceedings. And then secondly, I will discuss some talking points for teachers to consider in teaching media literacy, as well as how we can value the importance of context in teaching these ideas. Okay. So first, I feel it's important to find my mouse. Okay. To define propaganda. So when I looked up propaganda, there are two different definitions, and one was small caps and one was capitalized. And I think that's interesting to think about. So propaganda, generally speaking, is the spreading of ideas, information, or gossip for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. So I consider this informal, right? This is through talking. I mean, it can be through speeches as well. But I feel it can become more formalized in the capitalized version, which originally means a congregation of the Roman Curia having jurisdiction over missionary territories and related institutions. And so historically thinking about how that be interesting to see how that has evolved through time, right? So formal and informal communications create context. They create meaning to information. And such further communications that are very propagandic need to keep that momentum going in some way, right? They need to keep a conspiracy alive in some way. And these things were very accessible in the late 1800s in Germany and Austria. So I bring up the terms theosophy and erosophy because the two people I'm going to talk about, Guido von List and Helena Blavatsky, highly regarded these two movements as truth. Blavatsky is considered the founder of the Theosophical movement, and if you look online and you look for the Theosophical Society of America, she is referenced there numerous times. So it's very complex in that I think of it as many people who are looking for a sort of spiritual sense about themselves, who don't want to go to religion, are now thinking about these sorts of things, and how complex that is in itself. So in my research, I have found that theosophy is based on race, elitism as part of salvation, and hierarchical privilege based on initiations. This spread all over Europe and the United States in the late 1800s. So theosophy is like big. It's very big. Erosophy is more localized. It's based on race, theosophy and social Darwinism. It stayed strong in Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. So this way of thinking was very popular. People were talking about it during the time. There were a lot of prominent writers, philosophers who were engaged in these conversations. So Helena Blavatsky, who is this person? Well, she was a theosophist, and she wrote a text called The Secret Doctrine. The publication date from my copy that I have at home reads 1888. Other sources have its European publication date as 1881. Helena Blavatsky believed in the idea of astronomer Bailey's use of Atlantis, and this was published in the 1700s. So I'm just going to read a little bit from my paper that talks about this idea. I feel it sums it up pretty well. So there was a 17th century astrologer, Jean Sylvain Bailly, who declared Atlantis was not an island that once lay between Europe and America, but rather the equally mythical continent of Hyperborea. This Atlantis myth places Atlantis at the north instead of the ancient east. Okay, so as this origin story moved north, the idea of the first civilization in the world placed Nordic people first. And these people would be called Hyperboreans, and little is known about them except that they worshipped Apollo. And throughout the history and the thinking of the time, this would be considered under a lot of these occult societies where the Aryan race was shown to be superior. So we have that going on during this time. So within her secret doctrine, she created a hierarchy of root races, saying there are 7 root races and so forth. The Aryan is, of course, superior, and the Jew is a subrace. And there was a large following. I have a couple authors there, like I mentioned. And at the same time that, this idea was surfacing throughout the world, there were people that were skeptical. She was declared a fraud in 1885 by the London Society for Psychical Research. I think she was also kicked out of India at some point as well. And so we see a picture of her here. And this is an image that I took off the internet. And we can get a sense of the hypocrisy of how someone can be perceived, right, from just looking at something immediately online. And here we have this quote from her that says, I need my cheaters, the path that leadeth on is lighted by one fire, the light of daring burning in the heart. The more one dares, the more he shall obtain. And in the book, I just have one example here, but it is basically just a complete criticism of religion, and there's no base in what theosophy actually is. It's just more about how it's not like something else. So there really isn't any grounding in the whole document that I've read. I don't know if anyone's ever looked at it or read any parts of it. It's extremely complex and very kind of all over the place. So if we think about media literacy just from this point here, it's impossible to read everything that we see, a blib of this or that on the internet, but many groups that promote ideals based on zero grounding. And then someone can go on the internet and look and say, oh yeah, well, this relates to this idea in some way. They can all make it into an agenda for themselves. And I think that's really important to think about with students, is that they're looking online all the time, and they're thinking all the time, and they're wondering about their identity all the time. Right? It's what humans do, especially younger folks. Okay. Guido von List, he was very popular in Austria. He was one to denounce the Holy Roman Empire. He thought they were just nothing but trouble with the whole German sense of identity. He rewrote history to prove that the Germanic tribes really beat the Romans. He created a system called the Armenischaft, which is a hierarchical system of civilization, and this was in the late 1900s that he did this, but he died in 1919, and it was never, brought to fruition. And a large following, including Deputy Baranek, members of the Thule Society, and countless others who were a part of that whole early occult system of different groups who supported each other, right, and wanted to create this sense of superiority. So I'm going to read a little bit more about Guido von List from my paper here, about this whole idea about rewriting history. So one of his most famous rewrites was about the Battle of Carnuntum, noting it as a vivid walk into the past, and he published this in 1881, so kind of the same decade as the Secret Doctrine. Very little is recorded about Carnuntum today. I could find not too much about it from just saying general searches on the internet and so forth, or even with looking at some scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles. But what is known is that it was a legionary camp that became the capital of the province of Upper Pannonia, and during the 170s, Marcus Aurelius campaigned against the Marcomanni, which was a Germanic tribe, and destroyed this tribe. It was soon rebuilt and became a battleground again in 375 by Valentinian I. Not believing this could be true, List celebrated this year 375 in reverse, and he rewrote the history saying that the Germanic tribe called the Quadi overthrew the Romans. And people believe this. He took a short version of this book and turned it into a two-volume work in 1888, so just 7 years later, right? Just 7 years later. This attracted the Austrians because he also placed Austrian-settled tribes with the original German tribes in this newly recorded battle against the Romans, right? More importantly, his account of the time strongly suggested that the tribal settlers in the area were only interrupted twice, with the first being the Roman settlement and occupation of that area earlier, like I mentioned, and then conveniently saying, nope, we're here, and we won in 375. Right, so this continued to build and the momentum, and he kept writing things, and people kept believing. And by March of 1908, the List Society was formally opened, and it became, like the Thule Society during the time, a very popular and supported anti-Semitic group, along with other, semblances of why there is this sort of Aryan superiority within this Germanic Austrian identity, wanting to get away from the cultural assimilation of the time. So new history, new rules, right? New history, new rules. So in this spread like wildfire, he wrote many, many, many things, which I'll come back to in a moment. So why does this matter? And I think it matters greatly in understanding, especially in teaching about myth and propaganda, that they are very different. Okay? And through my research, this is what I've come up with and how we can think about them being different. They're both so abstract, right? They're from folklore, fairy tales, all sorts of things where we're talking about the human condition, which is going to take a lot of time to do research on for books and so forth. So how can we talk to students about this in a school year or, in conversation where we're trying to maintain neutral ground and we're trying to get our students to question things a little bit more, to be a little skeptical. Okay? So I feel, myth explains the nature of the universe. It gives respect to mystery, right? There's always a question being asked, and that answer isn't completely clear. Whereas propaganda, it's all about the other person. It's all about this other is doing something to us and instills fear, and right, because the other is the problem. I think that is always seen in propaganda. It divides and categorizes, and it promotes fear and lack, where in myth we want to discover truth. Humans are not ever seen as perfect. And if that's the case, we get to see why that is a problem. Just like I mentioned here, myth shows problems associated with creating an other, and gives a premise of greater understanding of the human condition, where propaganda is a premise of mistrust. Right? There's always this sense, in thinking about propaganda, someone following conspiracy theory or something like that, like in List's doctrine of new history, where there's this story to hang on to, which in List's time or his followers, giving this sense that they're going to be safe with this new idea. But there's a catch. There's always an enemy to watch out for. So how can you feel safe? Right? And I think this is the biggest failing in looking at some of this old propagandic, cultic stuff, because there's just not any base in feeling safe. Okay? So there's all this premise of mistrust going on. There's, a community like that can fall out quite easily, I feel. And I say it, propaganda also creates momentum of speculation, not facts. Right? Just as long as that momentum keeps going, right? But when you look on the internet, you can always find something to twist and turn. Where myth creates patterns to show human history, and I feel this last point here, this creating patterns of human history, is what the Nazis and the occult societies tried to exploit, right? To make their agenda seem liable. So that's just a scratching of the surface of what would be my paper in the conference proceedings. Like I said, I think it's just really important to think about how prominent the thinking is at the time and how that can influence groups like this. So I think it's important to recognize propaganda and myth are not the same. Early occult leaders influenced Nazism in many ways. So like with Blavatsky, she had the cosmic science, right? So the big, huge world, it's just predestined for you that you're racially determined to suffer, which is ridiculous. And von List had his localized sentiments with a very folkish attitude of the time, right? And they agreed with each other in some points. So if we think even about circular reasoning, right, of how things can be recycled for some other group's gain in some way, right? And networks of supporters created presses and newspapers, so here we have the more formalized sense of propaganda during the time, and it just kept going and going. So, for example, like I mentioned, Liszt Carnuntum, he became a very celebrated figure among numerous leaders. Georg Lanz von Liebenfels was a student of Liszt, and he went on to publish Ostera, which is like a small literary journal during the time, and he continued to write about racial purity and work in the Hitler regime. Liszt's anti-Semitism was celebrated in his plays. The tickets for this one in 1894, on the tickets it read, "Not valid for Jews." So even at that time, there was a sense of systemic separation in a lot of ways, right? So it's very heavy material, right? It's like, whew. And when we're, as educators, when we're doing research and we want to do research for our own, for things that we may want to write or for things we want to teach, I think it's just really important to recognize a sense of why we're doing this and to get a sense of our teaching and how it plays into our research. So this is why I brought up the idea of media literacy. I think it's so important. And I feel the complexities that we find in our work, we can break these things down through media literacy in our teaching. And I think for very good reason. I pulled a few statistics from a few sources here. So the first statistic is from a group called Media Literacy Now. It says the US is ranked 15th out of 44 countries surveyed for media literacy rates. The second statistic I took from Forbes and from the American Psychological Association. Teens spend an average of 5 to 8.5 hours on the screen a day. When I told my students that, they said it was more. They're like, no, it's more than that. I said, are you kidding me? They're like, no. I go, where do you find the time? But that's what they do. They're so used to that. And articles I read from Vice, and also in doing my own research for a book that I wrote 2 summers ago for an education publisher called The Creative Company. It's for 7th graders and 6th graders too. It's called Living in America, Fake News. So if anyone is interested in that, I'm glad to talk about that more. I think it's a great educational resource. And in that I found fake news stories such as Pizzagate way back. It still had, when I did my research for it 2 summers ago, it had 82 million hits on TikTok. 82 million hits on TikTok in it's crazy. Influencers like Elon Musk and Chris Sky have continued to spread its momentum just last year, so they're still holding on to that in a lot of ways. All right. So teaching propaganda, I think it's important when we think about information as neutral until we add context to it, right? And then we can ask questions. I feel, contextual analysis gives information rhetorical meaning. It gives it a charge. It gives it a sense of belonging in the time. So I mentioned here like carnuntum, right? The sense of the time, the secret doctrine from the sense of the time, right? So literature, you can always take it and read excerpts of it to really get at some of the main points from it and say, okay, why was this important during this time? Those sorts of questions. And asking questions, students are able to reflect on their own in a lot of different ways, like Kim mentioned in her presentation too. So it's not necessarily us as educators telling them what to believe, right, or anything like that. It's for them to learn to think well for themselves and to ask questions and to be okay asking questions and to be okay with how they feel about that. Right? So I mentioned here critical and creative thinking questions help to discern meaning. They promote empathy, because sometimes, this information can be very overwhelming to students, especially if they're just trying to understand images that they find on the internet, and they're like, well, why isn't this true? Well, why is it on there? Well, why do they let people put it on there? Those are really hard questions to answer. And empathy really helps students understand other people's situations. So looking at the videos of survivor testimony or things like that I know the Holocaust Museum does some short first-person testimonies even on their Facebook page that are really great. And in teaching empathy, you can help students understand other people's situations without them thinking their needs don't matter either. I think a lot of students may sometimes feel that there's a competition there, right? Instead of just more about promoting the empathy with learning about other people's stories. And empathy creates loving kindness and learning and transparency. It gives a sense of togetherness and learning about really hard things. So propaganda and media literacy go hand in hand. I pulled this definition from a PBS source that I have on my bibliography slide, but if you Google PBS media literacy, they have a really good blog and with educator material on there for K through 12. And they from this Media Literacy Education Association, media literacy is defined as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. Right? So when we look at certain images, we can think about different questions. And I bring up all these questions here because I'm an English teacher. I teach students how to write essays and create arguments, and so I'm all about the rhetorical situation and why the research matters in that rhetorical situation, if they're going to support their sources, and understanding what they're trying to put across to their readers. And I think it's really important to remember that all media images are constructed. Such as in advertising, news headlines, social media posts. They're very different than, listening to someone's story, sitting down and talking with someone one-on-one. Like there's a constructed image online because, they're doing it for a certain purpose, so forth. What do I want to do? So for example, I have these 4 images here of looking at different times the symbol of the swastika has been used. So the first image, there's not a date for it, but it was found in a Byzantine church in Israel So the Byzantine period is from 330 to 1453, so that's quite a period of time. So we see that used in that context. The next image is from the 1880s, 1890s. This is the design of the brooch that Helena Blavatsky wore. So she had a brooch and she wore it, and this was, she took that from the Theosophical Society's emblem. Right? So if I go back, let's see. There we go. Right, up on the top there. Right. The third image is actually a picture that I took when I was at the Nazi Documentation Center in Munich in October of last year. Okay. So in the documentation center there, they have a ton of, I don't want to say it, displays in which primary sources are, in glass, and people can take pictures, and they have tons of boards that you can read and learn about. For where I was at was about Hitler's rise in Munich. And so the picture of this is the Thule Society giving a death notice for some of their members that were killed in an attack in Munich. I can't remember the exact one at the time. And they had adopted the swastika for their symbolism as well. Right? And so that picture, or that image, is from 1919. And at the end, see the swastika at the end. This is an advertisement by the Pacific Biscuit Company from California in 1908. So there, even in the early 1900s in the United States, like a very positive sense of the swastika, because so many people were now traveling east, and it was everywhere. I think there was even a Girl Scout and Boy Scout magazines that had swastika on it. I think I remember from my LaFrac paper. So here this is, all these images, right, just like students see on the internet or anyone. So if we give them context, we can understand that the symbol itself isn't necessarily evil, but it was all about how the people used the symbol for whatever propagandic agenda they had. Because a lot of times students will just look at it and say, well, that's always an evil thing, right? That's always something to fear in some way. So teaching-wise, I think, myth shows us how propaganda can fail. So when we're dealing with abstract things, I think that's an important point that can be made to students if they just have a lot of questions and they're looking for a literal answer. It's very complex, but it may be a starting point to think about. Critical and creative thinking, asking questions, right? Having discussion, processing information, right? Instead of just, making one decision about something. Contextual analysis promotes media literacy and historical accuracy. And just being reflective. I have students in my classes do journals a lot. They journal about their writing. They journal about their day, right? Because humans change from day to day, and they might be learning material that's really challenging, and they're just having a bad day. They're just having a bad day, and they're like, oh, we got to talk about this today, So just free writing and journaling as part of a classroom experience helps students create a stronger voice for themselves. As a writing instructor, I teach composition, which is a general education requirement. Students have to take the class even if they don't like to write. So I really tell them, this is a class for you to understand how you can be creative and to understand your writing voice and what works for you as a writer for what you have to say, because I know you all have something to say. Right? It may not be about writing papers, but that you have something to say. So when they're more comfortable with that, I feel they're more confident and they're able to talk about harder things. because they're just more confident with what they have to say instead of trying to sound like I feel many of you can resonate with students when you're teaching and experiences you've had where students get nervous about speaking up because they feel they have to be right and they feel they're going to give a wrong answer, or they feel that it's just not the right thing to say in their paper instead of just understanding the process, right? Get into perfectionist syndrome, and yeah, we don't want to do that. So our teaching deals with many layers of human life. And the complexities really deserve complex answers, like so many of the presenters talked about today and yesterday, and with listening to Alexandra about her and thinking about the diaries, that it takes time to have those discussions. So I think media literacy helps students think for themselves and to also understand the truth of context and how words matter. Thank you.
All right, so I want to thank both Jessica and Heidi for their thoughtful presentations today. Again, as in the last session, we've really run out of time, so we won't be able to have questions. But again, they'll both be here in between sessions, so you can ask them a question if you would like to. I think for me, one of the connections between your presentations is that we are, for some reason, susceptible to propaganda. And the question is really why? Why do we believe that the Haitian immigrants of Springfield are eating the pets there? You know, why do we believe that Democrats are running a child sex ring out of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C.? These lies, this propaganda is successful because apparently people are willing to believe it, as bizarre as it is. So we have some hard questions to ask ourselves. And, as we try to make connections between the era of the Holocaust and the era of today, certainly the use of propaganda is one of the things we can focus on. Propaganda is very much in its heyday, again, it seems, just as it was during the Nazi period. So thank you again for your presentations, and we have about a 15-minute break, and then we'll start with our next session. We have one more session here in Sicilian Hall where we're going to be learning the story of the son of survivors of the Holocaust. We have a short film to show you that we produced here in our center here at Seton Hill, and our presenter is already with us, so we're eager for that. So we'll have a session here, and then afterwards we'll go up to a small group workshop where we'll learn about the opportunities for travel to the to Holocaust-related sites in Europe with Classrooms Without Borders. So that's what's on the agenda this afternoon, and then this evening we have an address from our visiting scholar, Dr. Tim Patetti, who's an expert in Native American history and literature, and we're all looking forward to that this evening. So let's take a 15-minute break and reconvene.